Imagine a vast, unforgiving desert where secrets are buried deeper than bones, where a single choice can echo across generations, and where one loyal dog uncovers a truth that shakes an entire town. This is the story of Garrett Crawford, a West Texas rancher who vanished without a trace, and Buster, the retired K9 who refused to let the desert keep its silence. If you believe in courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, you're in the right place. Welcome to K9 Miracle Stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a tale of heroism that will leave you inspired. Let's dive into a mystery that begins with a gust of wind and ends with a dog's relentless heart. The wind howled low across the West Texas plains, brushing tumbleweeds against an old, weather-beaten fence. It was 7:42 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, and Garrett Crawford stepped into his barn to check on a rattling tractor. Then, he vanished. No noise. No struggle. No goodbye. 1 minute, he was there, tinkering with his old John Deere. The next, it was as if the desert had swallowed him whole. His boots never crunched back across the gravel. His truck keys remained untouched on the passenger seat of his green Ford F-150. His wife, Sarah, never heard his voice again. For long years would pass before a single clue emerged. It wasn't a detective, a deputy, or a federal agent who found it. It was a dog, a retired U.S. Customs K9 named Buster, who wouldn't stop digging. His nose, trained to sniff out secrets, would unravel a mystery that had haunted Brewster County, Texas, and bring a silenced man's story back to life. That fateful Tuesday began like any other. Garrett, a third-generation rancher with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, had just finished dinner with Sarah. Meatloaf and green beans, nothing fancy, just the kind of meal that filled the belly and warmed the heart. He wiped the grease from his hands, stood from the table, and mentioned a rattling sound in the old tractor parked in the barn. "I'll be right back," he said, grabbing his flashlight. His voice was calm, unhurried. Garrett moved like the world could wait, his steps steady, his presence grounding. Sarah smiled, sipped her sweet tea, and flipped on the TV. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. By the time an hour had rolled by and the local news began its second segment, a stillness settled over the house. Sarah felt it, a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. She opened the front door and called out, "Garrett." The only reply was the chirp of crickets and the low, distant groan of cattle. Slipping on her boots, she walked to the barn, her heart picking up pace. The big green Ford sat idle by the gate, its driver's side door unlocked. The keys were still inside, along with a couple of feed store receipts fluttering on the seat. Garrett's wallet wasn't there, but that wasn't unusual, he often left it on the kitchen counter. The silence around her felt heavy, wrong. Sarah scanned the yard, then the barn. Its sliding door was half open, as if someone had gone inside but never come out. She called again. Nothing. Her gut twisted. She ran back to the house and dialed 911. Deputy Rick Ortega arrived 40 minutes later, his headlights slicing through the pitch-black night. Young, barely out of the academy, he was polite and attentive, taking Sarah's fear seriously. Together with Sarah and her 20-year-old son, Ben, they searched the barn. Flashlights swept across beams and corners. The air smelled of motor oil, hay, and dry dirt. There was no blood, no broken tools, no sign of a fight. Garrett's wrench lay beneath the tractor, as if he'd dropped it mid-task. It didn't look like someone had left. It looked like someone had disappeared. By midnight, Garrett Crawford was officially listed as a missing person. What followed was a West Texas-style search and rescue operation. Ranchers from 3 counties rode in on horseback. Volunteers brought dogs, ATVs, and even a chopper equipped with thermal cameras. 4 days, they combed every inch of the Crawford Ranch and beyond. But the land was merciless: thorny brush, steep ravines, snake dens, sun-bleached rocks. It was as if the earth had sealed its secrets. No torn clothes, no footprints, just dust and heartbreak. Investigators began pulling at the threads of Garrett's life. Bank records, loan documents, personal journals, they painted a grim picture. The ranch was in trouble. Years of drought and plummeting cattle prices had left the Crawfords drowning in debt. Letters from the bank piled up in the kitchen drawer. Garrett, a proud man carrying the weight of 3 generations, had grown distant, quiet, worn thin with shame. It was enough to spark a theory. Maybe he'd walked away, unable to face the collapse of his legacy. But Sarah refused to believe it. He wouldn't leave this land, she told Deputy Ortega, gripping a faded family photo. It's in his blood. Her voice was firm, her eyes fierce with conviction. The ranch wasn't just dirt and fences, it was Garrett's heart, his history, his fight. He wouldn't abandon it, no matter how heavy the burden. Time marched forward, but the pain didn't fade. Ben dropped his college plans to take over the ranch's daily work. He fixed fence lines, buried animals lost to drought, and aged faster than any 20-year-old should. Sarah, trapped in legal limbo without a death certificate, couldn't collect life insurance or refinance the ranch. She sold off cattle, sometimes at a loss, patched the tractor with borrowed parts, and leaned on faith to keep going. The years rolled by, each one heavier than the last. The barn stood silent, a monument to unanswered questions. The green Ford gathered dust. The wrench beneath the tractor rusted. And Garrett's name became a whisper in the sheriff's office, filed away in a cold case drawer. 3 years later, on a dusty jogging trail a few miles from the Crawford Ranch, Maria Sanchez ran every Tuesday afternoon with her German shepherd, Buster. He wasn't just a pet, he was a retired U.S. Customs K-9, trained in narcotics and human remains detection. Maria, a newcomer to Brewster County, knew little about Garrett Crawford's case. It had gone cold before she arrived. But Buster remembered smells. He remembered death. Something about that trail made his hackles rise. Every time they passed a certain patch of rocks, he slowed, sniffed, stared. His ears perked like a soldier recalling orders. Then he'd move on. Until one Tuesday, he didn't. He stopped dead, ears flat, muscles tense. Then he bolted. Maria's scream echoed across the trail. Buster! But the dog was already 50 yards ahead, digging furiously beneath a large slab of sandstone. This wasn't like the times he chased rabbits or rolled in the grass. His body was locked in, alert. His paws tore into the earth like something vital was buried beneath it. Maria froze, the hair on her arm standing straight. She'd never seen him like this. Stepping closer, her heart thudded. The rock looked out of place, like it had been set there deliberately. Buster, please, she whispered. He barked, short, deep, insistent. Maria pulled out her phone and called 911. You're going to think I'm crazy, she told the dispatcher. But my dog used to be with Border Patrol. He's trained. He's alerting to something. I think he found a grave. The deputy who arrived later that day was new, barely a year on the force. He nearly dismissed it as a false alarm from an overprotective pet owner. But protocol made him look closer. He noticed the loose, dark soil. He saw how the stone didn't quite belong. And something about Buster's intensity stuck with him. He called it in. 2 hours later, a forensics van rolled up. They pried up the sandstone slab, which groaned like an old door hinge. Beneath, the earth gave up a secret it had guarded for 4 years. It wasn't a body. It was something stranger. Folded men's clothing lay in a shallow pit, carefully arranged, not dumped. A brown canvas jacket, stiff with age and dust. A pair of faded jeans, folded like they'd come off a store shelf. A pale blue button-up shirt, laid flat beneath them. And on top, like a crown atop a grave, rested a sun-bleached desert tortoise shell. Duct taped to the shell was a cowboy hat, misshapen, its crown dented, stained, with a small puncture hole near the brim, like something sharp had pierced it long ago. The team went quiet. There were no bones, no blood. But this wasn't random. This was deliberate. A message. Detective Miles Corbin, preparing for retirement, was cleaning out his desk when the call came. You're going to want to see this, sir, the dispatcher said. Corbin drove out himself, the weight of old memories tightening around his shoulders with every mile. The Crawford case had haunted his last decade. No closure, no suspects, just a good man gone without a trace. When he arrived, the sun dipped behind the Chisos Mountains. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush. The scene was taped off, quiet and reverent. Corbin stepped under the yellow line, nodded to the young deputy, and knelt beside the grave. The second he saw the jacket, something in his chest tightened. Then he saw the hat. He didn't need DNA or lab tests. He'd stared at Garrett Crawford's missing person poster too many times. The man in the photo, smiling faintly against a fence post, wore that exact canvas jacket and cowboy hat. This was Garrett, or what was left of him. In the evidence room, the items were laid out on a sterile table. Corbin, gloves on, hovered over them like a priest performing last rites. His eyes scanned every fiber, every tear, every trace of time's wear. He was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, "Why would someone bury clothes and not the man?" No one had an answer. Across town, Sarah Crawford sat at her kitchen table, staring at high-resolution photos of the find. First the jacket, then the jeans, then the hat. She didn't cry right away. She'd trained herself not to after 4 years of holding on. But when she saw the puncture in the hat's crown, she gasped. She remembered Garrett coming home years ago, laughing about catching a mesquite branch while rounding cattle. "Damn thing nearly scalped me," he'd joked, tossing the hat onto the porch table. Her hand flew to her mouth. That was the same hat. The last desperate thread of hope, that maybe Garrett had run away, started a new life, snapped. He was dead. But why just the clothes? Why bury them like that? What did it mean? At Maria's house, Buster sat on the back porch, staring at the horizon, ears twitching at a far-off coyote's howl. He looked calm, but Maria knew better. He hadn't been the same since the dig. He didn't run, didn't beg for treats, barely slept. It was as if part of him had switched back on, something primal from his K9 days. Maria ruffled his ears. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. Buster exhaled hard, like he was trying to say yes. Corbin couldn't shake the tortoise shell. It wasn't just a weird flourish, it was symbolic, intentional. He remembered a border task force meeting years back where a DEA agent mentioned cartels using animals, even taxidermy, to send coded messages. He picked up the phone and called DA agent Daniel Suarez. Corbin described the scene, the folded clothes, the duct-taped tortoiseshell, the cowboy hat. Suarez went silent, then said, "That's a narco signature." "A warning," he explained. The turtle, especially taped like that, was cartel slang for an informant, a snitch. Whoever did this was calling Garrett a rat. "It's not just about the man," Suarez said. "It's about control, fear. It's their way of saying, this is what happens if you talk." Corbin felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a silencing. Corbin and Suarez pulled every file from the original case. Bank records, loan applications, an uncashed check for $17,450 from a cattle sale. Why would a man running from his life leave behind nearly 18 grand? They went through every bank statement with fresh eyes. And there it was, small, irregular cash deposits. $500 here, $1,200 there. Never consistent, never explained. Over 8 months, they added up to just under $50,000. The pattern didn't match cattle sales or equipment purchases. It looked like payments from someone who wanted to stay off the books. Meanwhile, Buster wouldn't stop circling. Every morning, Maria took him back to the trail to ease his mind, to give him closure. But instead of stopping where they found the clothes, he'd walk half a mile further, pause, sniff, whine. One morning, he bolted again, this time toward a run-down, half-collapsed shack behind a grove of mesquite. It had once been a hunting cabin. Now it was just bones and shadows. Buster didn't bark. He stood at the door and stared. Maria called Corbin immediately. Inside the cabin, they found what they'd feared: blood-stained rope, rusted shackles, scraps of faded cloth. The floorboards had been pried up long ago, the place swept clean by time, but traces remained. Buster sat outside the door, unmoving, watching. He had brought them to the last place Garrett had likely been alive. The evidence was enough to reclassify the case as an active homicide, but not enough for a conviction. No body, no weapon, just a tortured puzzle. Still, Corbin knew the truth. Garrett Crawford hadn't run. He hadn't broken. He'd stood up to something bigger than himself and paid for it. At dusk, Maria stood with Buster at the edge of the trail. The sky burned orange and gold. She looked down at him, his chin resting on her boot, and whispered, "You brought him home, didn't you?" Buster didn't move. He just watched the horizon, as if there was still more to find. They say the desert forgets, that time and sand and silence cover everything, swallowing footprints and memories alike. But sometimes the land doesn't forget. It waits for the right moment to speak. And when it did, it spoke through a dog. Buster hadn't led them to a body, but he'd led them to truth. Garrett Crawford's name was no longer just a whisper in a cold case drawer. It was on the radio, in the local paper, and scrawled across a whiteboard in a reopened homicide investigation. The desert had remembered. Now it was up to the living to listen. Detective Corbin stood at the edge of the abandoned shack Buster had found. The place was rotted, sun-warped, the kind of place teenagers might dare each other to enter on Halloween. But this wasn't kid stuff. Corbin stepped through the doorway, the boards groaning beneath his boots. The air smelled of rot and rust. The walls had holes punched through them. There was no furniture, just empty hooks where a lantern might have hung, and scraps of wire tangled in the corners like cobwebs. Near the center of the room, the forensics team found old blood traces, rope fibers, human hair, and heavy scuff marks around a support beam, as if someone had been tied to it and struggled. This wasn't just a hiding place. It had been a prison. Corbin didn't talk much during the ride back to the station. He kept glancing at the evidence bag on the seat beside him. Inside was a torn scrap of faded plaid fabric, possibly from the shirt Garrett wore the night he vanished. It was just a strip of cloth, no blood, no DNA yet. But for Corbin, it was enough. He knew what had happened here. Garrett had been held captive, tortured, and the killer hadn't even needed to bury him to erase him. In a land this vast and unforgiving, the desert did most of the cleanup itself. That night, Sarah sat on the porch swing, staring out over what was left of their ranch. The northern pasture was gone, sold off to keep the bank at bay. The barn had been stripped bare over the years. Only the main house remained, needing a new roof and fresh paint. Ben worked long hours to hold it together, saying little, just nodding and moving forward. When Sarah told him about the shack, about what the detectives found, he sat on the tailgate of Garrett's old truck and stared into space for 15 minutes. Then he stood and said, "I need to fix the fence at the south line." And walked off. That was Ben's way of grieving, quiet, steady, like the land. Across town, Maria couldn't sleep. Buster paced the house at night, not frantic, not anxious, just aware, alert, like something in him had switched fully back on. Maria had seen this before. She'd volunteered at a K9 retirement foundation in El Paso before adopting him. Most dogs, once retired, adjusted. They played, aged, softened. But Buster never fully let go of the job. Now, after finding Garrett's grave, the clothes, the cabin, something in him told Maria they weren't done. At the Brewster County Sheriff's Department, Corbin and Suarez built a new timeline. Step 1. Garrett had been approached by a cartel cell operating along the border. Step 2. He'd been offered cash to use a remote part of his barn. Step 3. He accepted, at least initially. The small cash deposits over 8 months proved as much. But why would a man like Garrett, quiet, moral, old school, get involved with drug runners? And what made him change his mind? The pieces didn't add up until Suarez suggested it might not have started with drugs. They dug deeper into Garrett's financials and found a hint: a short-term business license filed under a shell company 2 months before he vanished. Listed as an agricultural consultancy, it had no invoices, no address, no tax records. Morales wasn't a boss, just muscle, moving people and product, answering to higher-ups. But he knew things. And he was scared. Speaking low, glancing at the camera, he broke the case open. "Yes, I knew Garrett," he said. "I saw him once." He didn't want to be part of it. "What did he say?" Corbin asked. "He said he'd rather lose the ranch than let us traffic kids through it." The room went dead quiet. "Wait," Suarez said, leaning forward. "Kids?" Morales nodded. The cartel wanted to move people through the property, Not drugs, not cows, but women and girls. Garrett lost it. He said he'd call the cops, burn the barn down before letting it happen. And then what happened? Corbin asked. Morales looked down. They made an example out of him. Back at the ranch, the truth landed like a thunderclap. Garrett hadn't been weak. He hadn't given in. He'd stood up to monsters alone and paid the price. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The wind moved the curtains like slow breath. On the table lay a redacted sheriff's report, one line standing out: subject refused to sign deed transfer. Subject made threats to notify law enforcement. Execution was ordered by higher authority known only as Elato. Sarah whispered the name aloud. Elato. A shadow in the cartel chain, a man who'd stolen Garrett, silenced him, buried only his clothes. No one knew what he looked like, just a name. The sheriff's office held a small memorial. No body, no death certificate, but the community knew. Ranchers who'd worked beside Garrett for decades came with sunburnt faces, worn jeans, and heavy hearts. Sarah's hands trembled as she placed Garrett's cleaned hat, still bearing the mesquite branch scar, on a wooden cross outside the barn. Beside it, she set his father's wrench, found under the tractor the night he vanished. Then came Buster. Maria brought him forward on a leash, but he didn't need guidance. He walked to the cross and sat, not out of training, but out of knowing, out of respect. The crowd went quiet. Even the wind paused. Buster didn't bark, didn't move. He just watched the horizon, as if waiting. Sarah and Ben made a final decision. They put the ranch up for sale. The debts were too high, the memories too heavy. But they refused to sell to a corporation or out-of-state developer. They sold it to a neighboring ranching family, one Garrett had grown up with, who understood what the land meant, who'd keep it honest. Before leaving, Sarah walked the fence line one last time. The sky was deep blue, the cicadas humming like a lullaby. At the gate, Maria and Buster waited to say goodbye. Sarah knelt and looked Buster in the eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on him." Buster leaned in, pressed his forehead to her chest, and exhaled, a sound like peace. At the DEA's El Paso office, Suarez handed the file to a federal task force. Elato was likely back in Mexico, shielded by bribes and aliases. They had no photo, no fingerprints, but they had Morales' testimony and a pattern of operations. It wasn't enough for an indictment, but it opened a wider case. Garrett's death had lit a match, and the feds were paying attention. A raid on a storage yard outside Pecos uncovered unregistered vehicles, burner phones, and narcotics, enough to shut down the cartel cell that tried to buy Garrett's land. Elato, though, remained a ghost. One morning, Buster stopped eating. Maria thought it was the heat, then old age. But when she tried walking him down the trail where he'd found Garrett's grave, he turned back after a few steps. That night, he lay by the door and didn't get up. Maria stayed beside him, stroking his head as the desert wind rattled the screen door. "You did good, boy," she whispered. "You brought him home. You can rest now." Buster passed just before sunrise. The town held a service, a hero's send-off. The sheriff's office donated a flag, the DEA sent a letter of commendation. Maria buried him near the trail where he'd started digging, with a wooden marker, Buster, loyal to the end. He heard what no one else could. Weeks later, an anonymous tip landed on Suarez's desk, a grainy video from 6 years prior, recorded on a burner phone south of the border. It showed a man with a scar down his neck speaking to armed men near a ranch fence. Morales confirmed it instantly. "That's Elato." It wasn't enough to extradite, but it was something, a sliver of sunlight on the horizon. Sarah received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed letter. "Mrs. Crawford, your husband made the only choice a good man could have made. I never knew him personally, but I knew what he did. I was a part of what happened. I'm not proud of it. I can't undo it. But I hope you can find some peace knowing his story saved others. There are kids who are free today because he stood firm. I'm sorry." Attached was a surveillance photo from an ICE raid. 6 children led out of a van near the Arizona border, wide-eyed, dusty, but safe. Sarah read the letter twice, then placed it beside the wooden box holding mementos from the community. "You mattered, Garrett," she whispered. "You still do." Ben launched the Crawford Line, a non-profit to support ranchers and rural families facing financial distress. Its logo featured a cowboy hat atop a tortoise shell. The barn was rebuilt as a community space called The Line, hosting meetings, support groups, and workshops. A plaque read, "Garrett Crawford, 1950 to 2008. He was offered a way out. He chose to stand firm instead." Beside it, a photo of Buster, eyes alert, stance proud. Maria spoke at the dedication. "Buster wasn't just a dog," she said. "He was a witness, a searchlight, a messenger. He never asked for a thank you. He just wanted to be useful." The crowd stood, clapped, wept. Ben hugged her and whispered, "You gave us back our father." Maria smiled. "No, he did. I just followed him." An investigative journalist wrote The Cowboy Who Said No, a long-form article that went viral. Garrett became a symbol of morality's cost and value. Letters poured in from strangers, a single mother in Ohio, a vet from Montana, a fourth-grade class from Oregon with crayon drawings of a cowboy and a dog. Sarah hung them in the hallway. The Crawford Line helped 4 ranches avoid foreclosure, connected abused migrant women with safe housing, and distributed legal toolkits to over 300 families. Garrett's story saved more than any verdict could. A year later, a Chihuahua newspaper reported a man matching Alato's description gunned down in a cartel dispute. Corbin, retired, opened a grainy photo on his laptop. A long pause. Then he called Suarez. "I think the desert just evened the score," he said. No headlines, no fireworks, just a quiet nod between 2 men who knew justice sometimes looked like a man refusing to sign his land away, a dog refusing to stop digging, a family refusing to forget. The desert hasn't changed, vast, quiet, full of secrets. But on Juniper Trail, a bench sits beside a memorial stone. Garrett Crawford. He stood for what was right. Buster. He never stopped looking. Hikers leave treats, dog tags, flowers. The wind carries the stories, reshaping them but keeping the truth. One man stood when it was easier to kneel, one dog wouldn't stop until the truth was found. Garrett Crawford wasn't defined by how he died, but by how he lived, for the line he wouldn't cross, the voice he became without speaking publicly, and a dog trained for war who became a symbol of peace, loyalty, and never giving up. This is the story of Garrett Crawford and Buster, a tale of resilience, principle, and the unbreakable bond between man and animal. At K9 Miracle Stories, we bring you real stories that restore your faith in courage and loyalty. If this moved you, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Ring the bell so you never miss a story that matters. And we want to hear from you. If you were in Garrett's boots, facing impossible odds, would you have drawn the line? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this story alive. Stay kind, stay strong, and always listen, because sometimes the truth barks before it speaks.